The shot that killed Jacob Harper echoed through the Montana hills longer than any gunfire Kathryn Harper had ever heard. One moment she was hanging laundry in the yard of their modest homestead. The next she was cradling her husband's bloodied body while a band of cattle rustlers disappeared into the distance with their small herd, the only real asset the young couple had managed to accumulate after 3 years of backbreaking work. When the doctor arrived from town hours later, he found Kathryn still holding Jacob, her dress soaked crimson, her throat raw from screaming. By morning, everyone in Cottonwood Creek knew 2 things. Jacob Harper was dead, and his widow hadn't spoken a word since. That was in the spring of 1873. Now, as October painted the cottonwoods gold along the creek that gave the town its name, Kathryn lived alone in the cabin she and Jacob had built together. At 24, the widow Harper was a ghost of herself, moving through her days in silence, communicating through small gestures and the occasional written note when absolutely necessary. The townspeople spoke of her with pity in hushed tones, calling it the silence of grief, as if giving it a name might make the strangeness of it more bearable. The only person who didn't treat Kathryn with the awkward delicacy of handling fine china was Mary Thompson, the midwife who had delivered half the babies in the county. Mary brought food twice weekly and sat with Kathryn, filling the silence with stories about town gossip, never expecting a response but refusing to let the young widow fade completely into herself. "The Hollister brothers are bringing a cattle drive through next week," Mary said one afternoon as she unpacked a basket of preserves and bread. 500 head, they say, means the saloon will be full and decent women ought to stay clear of Main Street. She glanced at Kathryn, who was mending a shirt with practiced precision. "Not that you ever go to town these days, but thought you should know." Kathryn nodded slightly, her needle pausing only momentarily before continuing its steady rhythm through the fabric. "They've hired some new hands for the drive. One of them's been asking about buying land hereabouts. Matthew James is his name, quiet sort but decent by all accounts, not like those rowdy types that usually pass through." The widow's eyes remained fixed on her work, giving no indication that she cared about cattle drives or quiet cowboys looking for land. Yet Mary noticed how her shoulders seemed to tighten just slightly at the mention of cattle, the very thing that had cost Jacob his life. 3 days later, Kathryn was pulling carrots from her garden when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. Visitors were rare and unwelcome. She straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her apron as a tall figure on horseback appeared at the edge of her property. The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle. Even from a distance, Kathryn could see he was lean but broad-shouldered, with dark hair visible beneath a well-worn hat. As he approached, leading his horse, she noticed his eyes first alert but gentle, taking in everything about her homestead with quiet assessment. "Afternoon, madam," he called when he was close enough not to shout. "Name's Matthew James. I'm riding with the Hollister outfit." He stopped a respectful distance away. "Hope I'm not intruding." Kathryn stood still, her expression giving nothing away. She made no move to respond. Something in the man's eyes shifted, not pity or discomfort, but a kind of recognition. He nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself. "Mary Thompson mentioned your place, said you might have some knowledge of available land in these parts." He paused, then added more softly, "I understand if you'd rather not have visitors. I can be on my way." Kathryn hesitated, then gestured toward the well with a slight nod of her head. Matthew seemed to understand. "Much obliged if I could water my horse before heading back." She nodded again and returned to her carrots, aware of him leading his horse to the well. She expected him to leave immediately after, but instead, he began examining her property with interest: the leaning fence posts, the barn door hanging from one hinge, the corner of the roof that had started to sag. "You've got good land here," he said eventually, not looking directly at her as if knowing his gaze might make her uncomfortable. But seems like there's more work than one person should handle alone. She stiffened, pulling a carrot from the earth with more force than necessary. I don't mean any offense, he added quickly. Just an observation from someone who's worked plenty of homesteads. The Hollisters won't need me after the drive's done. I'd be willing to make repairs in exchange for meals and a place to sleep in your barn, just until I find my own piece of land. Kathryn straightened, finally looking at him fully. His proposal was unexpected, practical, and terribly presumptuous. She narrowed her eyes. Matthew met her gaze steadily. I understand your caution, madam. You don't know me from Adam, but Mary speaks highly of you, and I'm not asking for charity. Honest work for honest pay. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote it down, figuring you might want time to consider without having to give an answer right away. He placed the paper on the fence post nearest to her, then stepped back. I'll be in town till Wednesday. You can send word through Mary if you're interested. With that, he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away without expecting a response. Only after he disappeared did Kathryn retrieve the note. His handwriting was surprisingly neat for a cowboy. Mrs. Harper, I offer 2 weeks of labor repairing your homestead in exchange for meals and lodging in your barn. References available from Mary Thompson and Sheriff Gaines in Cottonwood Creek. Respectfully, Matthew James. Kathryn crumpled the note, then smoothed it out again. Her first instinct was to burn it. The last thing she needed was a strange man around, disrupting her solitude and bringing back memories of all she'd lost. Yet as she looked around at the homestead slowly falling into disrepair, she felt a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: practicality. Winter would come soon. The roof needed fixing before the snow. The fence had to be mended to keep predators from the chickens. Tasks Jacob would have handled. That evening she sat at her small table with a piece of paper and pencil, writing and crossing out words multiple times before settling on a simple message: 2 weeks. No longer. Daylight hours only. She gave it to Mary the next morning, along with a jar of preserves as if to soften the terseness of her response. Mary read it and smiled, patting Kathryn's hand. He's a good man, Kate. Been asking about Jacob too, wanted to know what happened. Seems he's had some experience with rustlers himself. Kathryn's eyes flashed with momentary alarm. Don't worry, Mary assured her. I didn't tell him everything. Just that you were widowed and haven't spoken since. He didn't seem put off by that, which speaks to his character, I think. Matthew arrived at dawn 2 days later, leading a mule loaded with tools. Kathryn watched from the window as he unloaded everything methodically, organizing it near the barn. Only after he finished did he approach the house, knocking lightly on the door. She opened it with her chin lifted slightly, determined to establish from the outset that this was a business arrangement, nothing more. Morning, Mrs. Harper, he said, hat in hand. Thought I'd start with the roof today, if that suits you. Kathryn nodded once, then pointed to a pot of coffee on the stove and a plate of cornbread on the table. Thank you kindly, he said, but made no move to enter. I'll take it outside if you don't mind. Don't want to track dirt in. She raised an eyebrow slightly but poured the coffee into a tin cup and wrapped the cornbread in a cloth, handing both to him without their fingers touching. I'll be up on the roof if you need anything, he said, then added with the ghost of a smile, just wave or throw something at me. For the first time in months, Kathryn felt her lips twitch slightly, not quite a smile, but the memory of one. By midday, the rhythmic sound of Matthew's hammering had become almost soothing as Kathryn worked in her garden. He'd removed his shirt in the October heat, and she caught herself watching the play of muscles across his back as he replaced rotted boards. When he climbed down for water, she quickly averted her eyes, embarrassed by her observation. Your roof was worse than it looked, he said, drinking deeply from the ladle at the well. Previous repairs were shoddy work. I'm doing it proper so it'll last. Kathryn pushed a small slate and piece of chalk toward him that she'd placed on the well's edge earlier. He looked at it for a moment before understanding. "Much obliged," he said, picking up the chalk. "Makes communication easier." She wrote quickly, "How long for the roof?" 2 days, I reckon. Then the fence and barn door, should have everything shipshape before I leave. She hesitated, then wrote, "Dinner at 6. Matthew nodded. "I'll clean up proper before coming in." True to his word, when Matthew knocked on her door that evening, his hair was damp from washing and he'd changed into a clean shirt. Kathryn gestured him to the table where a simple meal of rabbit stew and biscuits waited. "Smells wonderful," he said, waiting for her to sit first before taking his own seat. They ate in silence for several minutes before Matthew spoke again, his voice casual as if they were in the middle of a conversation. "I lost my brother to rustlers 3 years back in Wyoming territory. Found him shot through the heart, our cattle gone." He tore a biscuit in half, his eyes on his plate. Didn't speak much for almost a year after that, figured there wasn't much worth saying in a world that could take Tom like that. Kathryn's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly. "People don't understand that kind of silence," he continued. "They think you're broken somehow, but sometimes words just fail. Nothing seems adequate." He glanced up, meeting her eyes. "You don't need words to be heard by me, Mrs. Harper. I understand the language of grief better than most." Something shifted in Kathryn's chest, a loosening of a tightness she had carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't a natural part of her. She blinked rapidly, looking away. Matthew returned his attention to his meal, giving her the privacy to compose herself. "This stew is mighty fine," he said after a moment, his tone lighter. "Haven't had a home-cooked meal this good in longer than I can remember." Kathryn picked up the slate. "Thank you for complimenting your cooking. That's easy enough." She shook her head and wrote, "For understanding." His expression softened. "Like I said, Mrs. Harper, some things don't need words." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Matthew would arrive at dawn, eat the breakfast Kathryn left for him on the porch, and work until dusk. She would bring him water and food throughout the day, sometimes staying to watch him work, other times returning quickly to her own chores. In the evenings, they shared dinner, with Matthew doing most of the talking, never pushing her to respond, simply filling the silence with stories of places he'd seen and people he'd known. Kathryn found herself looking forward to these quiet meals, watching the way his hands moved as he described the mountains in Colorado or the vast plains of Kansas. He never mentioned Jacob or asked about her loss directly, but sometimes he'd share small pieces of his own grief, creating a space where her silence felt understood rather than awkward. On the 5th day, rain kept Matthew from roofing work. Instead, he built new shelves inside her root cellar and repaired her rocking chair that had been broken for months. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, he produced a deck of cards. "My mother taught me a game called Casino," he said, shuffling with practiced ease. "Simple enough, but keeps the mind sharp. Thought you might enjoy it." Kathryn hesitated before nodding. She hadn't played cards since Jacob died. The memory of their evening games was still raw, but somehow the thought of playing with Matthew didn't feel like a betrayal. He dealt the cards and explained the rules. Soon, they were engaged in the quiet strategy of the game, the only sounds the crackling fire and the soft placement of cards on the table between them. When Kathryn won the first hand, a small smile escaped her, the first real one in over 6 months. Matthew's eyes lit up at the sight. "There it is," he said softly. "Been wondering if you had a smile hiding somewhere." She ducked her head, embarrassed but not displeased. They played 3 more hands before he gathered the cards and bid her goodnight, heading back to his place in the barn. That night, Kathryn dreamed of Jacob for the first time without waking in tears. In the dream, he was smiling, nodding at her as if giving permission for something she hadn't yet asked. By the end of the first week, Matthew had repaired the roof completely and fixed the sagging corner of the porch. He was working on the fence when a group of riders appeared, 3 men Kathryn recognized with a cold shock of fear. They were part of the gang that had killed Jacob. She was hanging laundry when she spotted them, the shirt in her hands dropping to the dirt as panic froze her in place. Matthew noticed her reaction and followed her gaze to the approaching riders. Without a word, he moved to stand between her and the men, his hand resting casually near the gun at his hip. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called when they were close enough. "Something I can help you with." The leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek, eyed Matthew with suspicion. Just passing through, recognized the Harper place. His gaze shifted to Kathryn, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Heard the widow was still here all alone. Thought we'd check in neighborly-like." "That's mighty thoughtful," Matthew replied, his tone pleasant though Kathryn could see the tension in his shoulders. "But as you can see, Mrs. Harper isn't alone, and she's not receiving visitors today." The man's smile faded. "Don't recall seeing you around before." Matthew James. "I work for the Hollister outfit. Hollisters are moving their herd south." "They are. I'm staying on, bought land just over the ridge there." It was a lie, Kathryn realized. He hadn't bought any land yet, but the casual confidence in his voice made it sound like truth. The scarred man exchanged looks with his companions. "Well then, guess we'll be on our way." He tipped his hat mockingly toward Kathryn. "Madam." They rode away slowly, looking back several times. Only when they disappeared from view did Matthew turn to Kathryn, his expression grim. "You know them," she nodded, her hands trembling. "They're the ones who killed your husband." Another nod. Tears filled her eyes. Matthew's jaw tightened. "Sheriff know about them." Kathryn picked up a fallen piece of laundry, clutching it tightly before reaching for her slate. "He knows." "Can't prove it, I see." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "They won't be back today, but they will be back. Men like that always come back," she wrote. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I don't plan to let anything happen to you, Mrs. Harper." Something in his eyes' determination mixed with a deeper emotion she wasn't ready to name made her breath catch. She looked away first, returning to her laundry with shaking hands. That night, Matthew didn't go to the barn. Instead, he sat in a chair by her front door, his rifle across his lap. When Kathryn brought him a blanket, their fingers brushed for the first time. The contact sent a jolt through her that was both alarming and strangely comforting. "Try to get some sleep," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." She hesitated, then wrote, "Matthew, thank you." "First time you've used my name," he observed with a small smile. "I like the sound of it." She blushed and hurried back inside, but not before catching the warmth in his eyes that made her feel both vulnerable and protected. In the days that followed, Matthew worked even more diligently on the homestead, reinforcing doors and windows in addition to the repairs they'd agreed upon. He also made a point of being visible whenever riders passed by, making it clear that Kathryn was no longer alone. She noticed he kept his gun closer at hand and seemed more alert to sounds beyond the property line. The evening meals continued, but with a new layer of tension beneath their quiet companionship. Kathryn found herself watching Matthew more openly, noting the gentle way he handled her dishes, the respectful distance he always maintained, the intelligence in his eyes when he spoke of books he'd read or places he hoped to see. On the 10th day, Matthew finished the last of the agreed-upon repairs. The barn door now swung smoothly on new hinges. As the sun began to set, he found Kathryn by the garden, gathering the last of the season's tomatoes. "All done," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Place as secure as I can make it." She straightened, looking around at all he had accomplished. The homestead looked better than it had even when Jacob was alive. She wrote, "You did more than we agreed. Wanted to do it right." He hesitated. "I'll be leaving day after tomorrow, as agreed." Kathryn felt an unexpected pang at his words. The thought of returning to complete solitude after these days of quiet companionship was more distressing than she'd anticipated. "Sheriff Gaines is keeping an eye out for those men," Matthew continued, "but they haven't been back to town yet." She nodded, her eyes drifting to the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Kathryn." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice made her look at him directly. "I need to ask you something." She waited, heart suddenly pounding. I did find land, 20 acres bordering your northern property line. Good water, decent grazing, I'm buying it tomorrow. He took a deep breath. I'd like to court you properly if you'd allow it. Her eyes widened in shock. I know it's soon, he hurried on. I know you're still grieving, and I would never presume to replace what you lost, but these past days. He struggled for words which struck her as ironic given her own silence. I've come to care for you, your strength, your kindness, the way you listen without judgment. Kathryn stood frozen, the basket of tomatoes forgotten at her feet. You don't have to answer now, Matthew said gently. You don't have to answer at all if you don't wish to. I just wanted you to know that when I leave here, it doesn't have to be goodbye, not unless you want it to be. She reached for her slate with trembling fingers. I don't know if I can feel that way again. I understand, he said, though disappointment flickered briefly in his eyes. Just know the offer stands, for however long it takes. That night, Kathryn barely slept. She paced her small cabin, thinking of Jacob, his laugh, his dreams for their future, the life they'd planned together. She thought of the silence that had enveloped her after his death, how it had become both shield and prison. And she thought of Matthew, different from Jacob in so many ways, yet similar in his quiet integrity, his gentle strength. How he'd understood her silence from the beginning. How safe she felt in his presence. By dawn, she had made a decision. Matthew arrived as the sun broke over the hills, prepared for his final day of work. He found Kathryn waiting on the porch, a small valise at her feet. Morning, he said cautiously, taking in the bag and her determined expression. She held out her slate. Take me with you to town today. His eyebrows rose in surprise. To town? You haven't gone in months from what Mary says. She nodded firmly, writing, It's time, need to see the sheriff and the land office. The land office, he repeated, confusion evident. Before she could explain further, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn. The scarred man had returned, this time with 5 riders instead of 2. Matthew moved in front of Kathryn, his hand going to his gun. Stay behind me, he murmured. If shooting starts, run for the barn. The riders stopped a short distance away. Well now, the scarred man called, ain't this cozy, the widow and her new man bright and early. State your business, mister, Matthew replied, his voice hard. This is private property. Our business is with the widow. The man's smile was cold. See, we think she might have something that belongs to us. Kathryn clutched Matthew's arm in alarm. Mrs. Harper doesn't have anything of yours, Matthew said evenly. Best you move on. That right, because her husband took something valuable from us before we had to. Retire him. A map. Shows the location of a particular mine we've been looking for. The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. We checked his body after, but he didn't have it on him. Figure it must be in the house. Matthew's expression remained neutral, but Kathryn could feel the tension radiating from him. Don't know anything about a map, but I do know you're trespassing and the lady wants you to leave, the scarred man laughed. Lady hasn't said a word from what I can tell. He drew his gun casually. Now step aside, cowboy. We're going to search that house with or without your permission. What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. Matthew drew and fired in one fluid motion, hitting the scarred man's shoulder. As the man reeled in his saddle, the other riders reached for their weapons. Matthew pushed Kathryn toward the door, firing again to provide cover. She stumbled inside, hearing the explosion of gunfire behind her. Through the window, she saw Matthew dive behind the water trough as bullets splintered wood around him. He returned fire steadily, dropping one rider then another. Terror clutched at Kathryn's throat as she watched the remaining men spread out, trying to flank Matthew's position. Without thinking, she grabbed Jacob's old rifle from above the fireplace and moved to the side window. Her hands shook as she raised it, memories of Jacob teaching her to shoot flashing through her mind. One of the riders was creeping toward the back of the water trough, out of Matthew's line of sight. Kathryn steadied the rifle, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. The blast knocked her back a step, but her aim was true. The man fell, clutching his leg. The unexpected shot from the house threw the remaining riders into confusion, giving Matthew the opening he needed. He fired twice more in quick succession, hitting another man in the shoulder. The scarred leader, bleeding heavily now, shouted to his remaining man. "Fall back! Fall back!" They retreated hastily, dragging their wounded with them. Matthew kept his gun trained on them until they disappeared from view, then ran to the house, bursting through the door with fear etched on his face. "Kathryn, are you hurt?" She shook her head, still clutching the rifle. Her whole body was trembling, but a strange calm had settled over her. When Matthew gently took the gun from her hands and pulled her into his arms, she didn't resist. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he murmured into her hair. "You saved my life." She pulled back slightly to look at him, reaching up to touch a graze on his cheek where a bullet had passed too close. Her fingers traced the wound gently. "It's nothing," he assured her. "We need to get to town, warn the sheriff there in the area." She nodded, then surprised him by reaching for her slate. "There is a map." "What?" Jacob found their campsite, saw a map of the Lost Horse Mine. They caught him looking. "That's why they killed him." Matthew's expression darkened. "You've had this information all along." "Why didn't you tell the sheriff?" Her hands shook as she wrote. "No proof. My word against theirs, and I have no words." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You couldn't tell anyone, not without speaking." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "But you can write it down now," he said gently. "We'll take it to Sheriff Gaines together. With what happened here today, it'll be enough to get a posse after them." Kathryn took a deep breath, then wrote, "I'm ready." The ride to Cottonwood Creek was tense, both of them watching for any sign of the rustlers returning. But they reached town without incident, causing quite a stir as they rode down Main Street together. People stopped to stare at the widow Harper, out in public for the first time since her husband's death, riding beside the Hollister cowboy everyone had been talking about. Sheriff Gaines listened gravely to Matthew's account of the attack, his eyes widening when Kathryn handed him a written statement about the map and Jacob's murder. He immediately organized a posse to go after the wounded men, promising to send deputies to watch the Harper homestead until the gang was apprehended. Afterward, Matthew accompanied Kathryn to the land office, where he completed the purchase of the 20 acres adjoining her property. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, he looked at her questioningly. "Would you like to see Mary while we're in town? She'd be mighty pleased to see you." Kathryn shook her head, writing, "Take me home." They rode back in companionable silence as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. When they reached her homestead, Matthew helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "I should check the property, make sure those men haven't circled back," he said, reluctantly stepping away. She nodded, watching him lead both horses to the barn. While he was gone, she went inside and removed something from a loose floorboard under her bed, a small leather pouch containing her most precious possessions. Her wedding ring, a lock of Jacob's hair, and a locket with a tiny portrait of him inside. When Matthew returned, she was sitting on the porch steps, the pouch in her lap. He sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. "All clear," he reported. "Sheriff's men should be here by nightfall." Kathryn opened the pouch and removed the locket, holding it in her palm for a long moment before offering it to Matthew. He took it carefully, opening it to see Jacob's face. "He looks like he was a good man," Matthew said quietly. She nodded, taking back the locket and returning it to the pouch. Then she picked up her slate. "He would want me to live." "Yes," Matthew agreed. "I believe he would. I have been silent for so long. You've had reason to be." She hesitated, then wrote, "But maybe it's time to try again." Matthew watched her with gentle eyes, waiting. She set down the slate, took a deep breath, and for the first time in over 6 months pushed sound past her lips. The word came out as a rough whisper, barely audible. "Matthew." His eyes widened in surprise, then filled with something that looked remarkably like love. "Kathryn," he whispered back, as if her name were the most precious word in the language. She swallowed hard, finding the next words even more difficult. "Stay, please." Matthew's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he reached for her hand. "For as long as you'll have me," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't need words to be heard by me, but I'll treasure everyone you choose to share." When he leaned forward to kiss her, Kathryn met him halfway, her silence finally breaking in the arms of a man who had understood it all along. The following spring, with the scarred man and his gang long since tried and hanged for Jacob's murder and countless other crimes, Kathryn Harper became Kathryn James in a small ceremony by the creek. Her voice was still halting, words sometimes failing her when emotions ran high, but Matthew never seemed to mind. "Some things," he often said, "are beyond words anyway." Their joined properties flourished under their care, becoming one of the most prosperous small ranches in the territory. And if the locals sometimes whispered about how the silent widow had found her voice again in the arms of a quiet cowboy well, Kathryn didn't mind. She knew better than most that the deepest truths often resided in the spaces between words, in the language of hearts that recognized each other across the wilderness of grief, finding home in unexpected places.